everybody, and welcome to the Eco Mindset Podcast. Today I have a very special guest, Howard Breen from British Columbia, somebody who's been involved with all kinds of direct action through his activist career. Most recently, Mr. Breen was sentenced to a year of house arrest for his political and environmental advocacy. Howard, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. Can you tell us about this most recent conviction and this sentence to house arrest that you've gotten? What were the protests that you were participating in that led to this, and how's it going so far?
Yeah, this occurred on October 25th, so it was a recent sentencing, but the trial goes back to August of 23, and the charges go back to 2021 and 2022. So it's been a long journey for both myself and my co-defendant, Melanie Murray. We were both jointly charged, different numbers of counts and different sentences, but we were tried together throughout the entire court proceeding. The actions that landed me in this judicial jeopardy were 3 highway blockades for Extinction Rebellion here in Nanaimo, as well as I held up a raw log ship in Nanaimo Harbor by gluing down to a log boom that I swam out to, as well as a airport tarmac occupation, and that ended up with a separate charge under the Canadian Aeronautics Act. And what am I forgetting? The final action was a Wet'suwet'en solidarity action against the RBC Bank, which is the major funder in the Coastal GasLink pipeline and LNG Canada. So the RCMP chose to bunch all of those together, unlike many other actions that I had done on Vancouver Island, specifically in Victoria, which was some 20-odd arrests, but never ending up in a court process whatsoever. Very different in terms of dealing with the National Police. They bunched everything together and clobbered me with the hope of getting a as you pointed out, they were asking for a 6 months imprisonment. That's on top of the 930 days I'd already done pre-trial, which was 5 months of house arrest, where I'm not allowed to leave this cabin. And you add that to the current sentence of another 6 months, that's 11 months that I will have been incapacitated on house detainment.
Right. So it's very interesting. I think you have a lot of courage, right, for doing a lot of these actions. And I know that a lot of people across the country admire your work. Can you tell us a bit about what I would expect would be the most extreme action out of the 3 you mentioned, which is the action at the airport? I know that, across North America and around the world, there's been some Extinction Rebellion activists that have, got into the airport tarmac and tried to send a message about the impacts of aviation by holding up some flights. Can you tell us a bit about what happened on that day?
It began, well, backpedal a little bit. It took a month of planning to make sure that there was not going to be any undue risk to airport passengers. And on the day of the action, I was accompanied with about a dozen other Extinction Rebellion activists who maintained a rally at the front entrance of the airport terminal on the grounds and engaged in conversations with the airport management in respect to that. I slipped inside just to double check the marquee and at the gate that there wouldn't be an incoming flight during my planned action. And then I slipped away and was driven to a spot that we'd already chosen that would make for the quickest attempt to get over the airport security fence, and I scaled it and at the far end of the runway and walked the length of the taxi runway. But while I was doing that, I detonated a smoke bombs so that the tower would be aware that I was on their grounds. And I spray painted a slogan about runaway climate change being very much connected to the runway itself, because they've been doing a lot of expansion at this regional airport. And much like a lot of runways in that you just spoke about of other actions in Europe, where they've been shutting down primarily regional airports so that there was harmonization between countries in respect to regional airports being not used for domestic flights. And we're doing puddle hopping from Vancouver to Nanaimo, which is totally
Right.
unnecessary when we have an excellent ferry service to get to Nanaimo from Vancouver and vice versa. So that just boggles the mind that we would be in a country that has yet to meet its Paris Accord commitment to allow for expansion of particularly international flights now coming into Nanaimo and Victoria, which are new developments because of runway extensions and so forth, right? So they took it pretty seriously. I had to, after arrest, I was placed under duress to give them a DNA sample, which is contrary to Canadian law, right? But I just didn't feel like spending another 3 days in incarceration in a holding cell waiting for to make my case before a judge. So I just submitted to their request. But
Right. So just to back up a bit, so you did this action, you spray painted on the tarmac, and then I assume the police were called. They came to pick you up relatively quickly, I take it?
no, not at all. In my testimony in the trial, I mentioned that I probably did a public service to the airport in respect to security, because it took 40 minutes for the RCMP to arrive and probably maybe 10 more minutes for them to decide what they were going to do with me before they arrested me. So it was like, had I been someone else that could have put passengers and aircraft at risk, you can't count on the local RCMP to be there in a timely manner, right? So I brought that up. It may have had some bearing in terms of my intent with particularly the judge. Judge Lamperson was very, very different in it comparatively to other judges that have been recently adjudicating, particularly the Fairy Creek trials that came through, and as well as other types of actions that I would have expected probably the Crown to have won his request for imprisonment at the end of our trial last month. Yeah, this particular judge, he understood the climate imperative. But because we were arguing for the first time in Canada climate necessity defense, he was very empathetic towards the cause, but he did not recognize imminent peril in the context of higher court decisions, appellate court decisions in Vancouver that had ruled a very constrained definition of what would end legal test for the climate necessity argument. So we had the first climate expert and a legal philosopher from UBC that is world renowned for her research into nonviolent civil disobedience. So the two of them together were allowed to become expert witnesses in the context of this trial. But the Crown reneged on their agreement with us and immediately tried to create constraints on the experts so that the judge could not get a broad interpretation of the climate necessity argumentation.
Hmm. So do you have any plans to appeal this decision and maybe to go and be able to make this necessity defense at the appeal or Supreme Court eventually?
I don't think so, because we've looked at it under that lens, and what we came to understand is that the higher court really had the final say in respect to what this was, which was a provincial court trial. And so we weren't just handcuffed, the judge was handcuffed as well. And there was not a lot that we could. It would have been a costly exercise with even less of a chance of finding an error in law that could be successfully argued. So we had already tried a charter challenge earlier. It was a trial within a trial right from the outset, and we failed to make that argument as well. So one could say that it was a failed attempt in a lower court because of the higher court rulings. But what we did learn was, after some reflection, that we actually can create a scenario that would meet the higher court legal test for a necessity defense. The only problem with that is you're looking at far more legal jeopardy, possibly 2 years in prison, if you're not acquitted on that basis.
Right, because the sentence could have been more severe than what they ultimately imposed.
Yes, yes. Particularly now, with now having been convicted on 6 counts and a breach as well, 2 breaches, I would be definitely looking at more jeopardy anyway if I were to be rearrested. But it's very tempting because I don't want to say on air what the scenarios would be for a successful necessity defense under the appellate court legal test, but it's not insurmountable if you apply it technically to meet that test. So you know, and at the
Interesting.
same time, I have to be careful about advising anybody while I'm currently under a community service order, which means that the imprisonment element of the sentence was suspended while I'm on house detention, right? So that goes on for actually 9 months, the CSO. So if I were to breach right now, if I were to step outside that door, and if the police saw me and I wasn't, it's not allowed. This is 2 pages of how they constrain me every single day of the week as what I'm allowed to do to while I'm on the community service order.
So what exactly are you allowed to do at this point? You've got conditions for house arrest. You can't leave. You can't go outside. You can't open your door and set foot outside.
No, not unless it's in my permission letter, which I have to carry with me at all times. Otherwise, the RCMP could execute a warrant for my arrest. And in this case, I would be looking at the full sentence CSO order, which would be 9 months imprisonment.
Right.
So
Are you allowed to go out for groceries, medical appointments?
twice a week, I'm allowed to go for what they call necessities of life, but they have to be spelled out in the letter. And that includes, right at the moment, just groceries. And if I have a medical appointment, which I do, I have some oral surgery coming up later this month. It's in the letter, and it specifies the time that I can leave my home to have the surgery and the time that I'm expected to be back. So it's all very specific so that the RCMP can feel comfortable knowing exactly what that window of
Yeah.
opportunity is
And if
for.
the dentist calls you and they want to change the schedule, you have to get permission from the RCMP for that. Yeah.
From my CSO supervisor. It
Okay.
has to, the letter has to be changed. So right at the moment, that could take 2 weeks. Could be faster because she's not in the office. She's in other communities as well. So if she gets a voice message soon enough, she might be able to do it in 2 days turnaround. But anything shorter than that, I probably would have to reschedule the surgery.
Well, it must be nice for her to be able to deal with you, an environmental activist, rather than a bunch of criminals, eh?
Well, it's hard to say what she thinks of me. They
Right, they're neutral
generally
and
deal with you with quite a poker face, and
right.
she's was very, very clear in terms of everything. She reread the entire CSO order, which was a number of pages, to me, and just reiterating what the judge had decided, but spelling it out what each word meant. Inside your home means inside your home. You can't be out on the porch. You can't be walking about on the property. It's house detention. It's elevated me to, I guess, the the harshest sentence for climate activists in Canada at this time.
That's interesting. I didn't know that it had risen to that point. Over in Montreal, I'm sure you've heard about this. There were some people who got up on the Jacques Cartier Bridge to hold up a banner. The police shut down the traffic under the bridge at rush hour. And, the people who were arrested there, they went to jail at least for a certain period of time. Their trial has not been completed, but the main activist from that was in jail for over a week. He started a hunger strike towards the end. They made the odd choice of arresting the person who was there as a liaison for the police, charging her with mischief, and also putting her in jail for a couple of days and releasing her with conditions that she was not allowed to speak about what took place, was not allowed to advocate for her point of view in the mainstream media or elsewhere. Were there any attempts to silence you during these procedures?
Oddly, no, but the Crown did remark to my defense lawyer, Joey Doyle, that he was aware of Roger Hallam's sentencing outcome, which he received 5 years for just advising highway blockaders for the M25 highway on a Zoom call. He received 5 years prison for that. So the Crown was aware of it. He didn't specify that, but initially on my bail, I wasn't allowed to talk to members of Extinction Rebellion for a period of time. And then after, I think it was out of the 5 months that I served on house arrest, before they lifted it, it was, I think it was around the 3 month mark when they removed that condition for a period of time.
Okay.
So it's certainly in their tool set for sure to prevent contact with. It's not unusual for co-defendants not to be able to talk with each other except in the presence of a lawyer, so that you don't cook up a story for the purposes of the trial. But they also restricted me from talking to other activists that I've been involved with here locally on particularly the highway blockades.
Interesting. So how are you adapting to this? I mean, I guess it's not new for you, the house arrest, because it's already been months in the pre-sentencing period, but how's life on house arrest?
It's they do allow visitation, so that was while I've been incapacitated, I've been inundated with support. So I had two friends from Extinction Rebellion bring a vegan meal for me last night and that kind of thing. So that's it sort of minimizes the despair folks might feel. And it's been kind of rough when, we just went through a provincial election that just sort of in some ways mimic what happened south of the border, or at least they tried to. And then to see what was happening in that respect, I think a great many of my friends are quite heartbroken and depressed now because of, in respect to the climate emergency, things have never looked worse than they currently do. We're looking at, I don't know what the figure is, 14 million annually in the next 20 years. That's a lot of people annually dying because of heat waves and drownings and other associated climate disasters, right?
Yeah, not to mention air quality. There's a
Well, yeah,
statistic that there's 1,500 premature deaths per year in Montreal just from air quality. And there are some things that have been done to mitigate the problem a bit, like, banning the use of fireplaces in the city and that kind of thing. But there's a lot more work to do. And I think that a lot of people, they overlook like the consequences of pollution. It's like kind of a subject a lot of people don't want to think about. They don't want to, expose themselves to the unfortunate reality of a lot of these things.
right, right. Have you experienced in Montreal the current smoke coming up from New York and New Jersey with their wildfires that are still not contained on the East Coast? And I guess you probably felt the aftermath of Milton and Helene as well, right? We
Yeah,
just
that for
experienced.
sure. And last summer we had smoke in Montreal for really what seemed like the first time in my life that we had smoke, out of control wildfires in northern Quebec, the smoke coming all the way down here, making it difficult to see across the street. I had experienced fire smoke before, like in the Yukon and in Edmonton also, but never here in Montreal. It never happened before. Like I know in BC, it's like more of a regular occurrence, but it was really something to live it like in your home place. the first time I had gone through smoke, it was on a road trip in the Yukon. So when it would get smoky, we would just not stop there. We would, put on our cartridge mask, drive through the smoke, and find a nice place to sleep. When I was in Edmonton, it was early last year. I was there for the provincial election helping the Green Party. And that was the first time I experienced smoke without the ability to leave because I was in Edmonton for that week and you could barely go outside. Like, under all the street lights, you would see like the clouds of smoke and everything. So that was quite something. We had to build filters and everything for the house that we were staying in out of furnace filters and box fans. And I was telling people there, like, this is unlivable. I don't know how you guys like deal with this on a regular basis. But sure enough, that very same summer, come back and live the exact same thing in Montreal. I went up to one of the towns actually that was evacuated because of the fires. The entire town was nearly wiped out. Luckily, they managed to save it. But one of the things that the mayor said was that, you have these increasing fires. One of the reasons they're so strong is that the forestry industry does not plant deciduous or, people know them as leafy trees after they log the areas. They want to plant pine trees so that they can harvest them because they're commercial trees. Well, people who have made campfires know that if you put a branch of a leafy tree onto a fire and it hasn't been dried out, it won't burn, But if you take a pine needle tree and you put that onto a flame, well, those pine needles, the resin in them will burn
Right.
with just a minimal heat source. So the forestry industry is making the forest more susceptible to burn and is killing the biodiversity of it. We're replacing, these forests with these genetic clones from commercial forestry. It's a huge problem. And of course, climate change is important too, but the way that, this, some would call it renewable resource of wood is managed is highly problematic as well. Since we're on the subject of forestry, you mentioned your involvement with Fairy Creek. Were those some of the charges that were included in this latest sentencing as well?
It was Save Old Growth,
Okay.
which was a sister group of a campaign that grew out of Extinction Rebellion, both in Vancouver, Victoria, and Nanaimo. And we accompanied the Fairy Creek campaign, but in those three cities. So there was highway blocks that were supporting the demand for an end to old growth logging, not just in Fairy Creek, but the entire province. And we tended to express more of a climate connection than Fairy Creek did, because being out in the urban environment, it naturally resonated better than what it would for people that were unfamiliar with the ancient forests in the Fairy Creek context. So yeah, it certainly bolstered reciprocally the effort at Fairy Creek, but also to bring the climate issue into the forestry concern, right? So
Yeah.
and
And
now we're seeing
since
so much of that with BC forestry at an all-time low right now. And we're seeing our old growth being raised by wildfires like Jasper, to see protected areas that have been around and cherished in our national park system to be raised by wildfires that exceed our national, not just our provincial, but our national carbon budgets now, because they're not calculated in the big scheme of things. So things are far worse for that debate. And here we are, we've spent Polyev has gone on muster support for the elimination of the carbon tax, not just nationally, but even here by a provincial government like the NDP has supported that call to end the carbon tax, which is, we're so far removed from having what should have happened provincially was the first climate election to address these massive concerns that we're ignoring politically. It's beyond political negligence and gross oversight now by the fact that we're not dealing with that. And sure, there's a lot of cosmetic things. Almost every BC minister has some kind of, in their mandate letters, a reference to the climate issue, but when you actually look at policy implementation, there's almost nothing. There's Clean BC, which is just to give cover to the accelerated buildup of LNG pipelines throughout the province to every community.
Right. So do you see any positivity with the reelection of the NDP government in terms of climate?
I do think that David Eby is a very different politician than John Horgan. John, as we know, just recently passed away, and the tributes have been almost canonizing the man as John the Good, St. John. And it's reminiscent of the kind of outcome that happened with Jack Layton. Well, yes, he brought the NDP back from obscurity for 2 elections, and but what did he do with it? What is John's legacy other than the $10 a day childcare benefit and Clean BC, which, as I just said, is a is just a to give cover to the LNG development in the province. So
Yeah.
there's really nothing. I think there were some significant labor policy changes that were made, and uh, I'm happy to give him credit for that. But when you look at what that means for the working class in BC in terms of their futures and their families' futures, when this bust and boom with LNG, it's very, very clear now that we may end up with massive stranded assets in terms of gas pipelines because the US and other countries beat us to the punch in terms of export. And
Yeah.
there's a lot of indigenous resistance to, like the Wet'suwet'en are looking at another 2 gas pipelines. The resistance isn't going to end with the Coastal GasLink pipeline. It's going to carry on. So we're in a place that is polarizing everyone. Sadly, we lost the Green Party leader. She won the only televised debate we had. She was the clear front runner in that respect, but the NDP diverted their resources to put money and staff into defeating her personally in the riding she was running in, and she lost.
Right.
Not only have we lost a really good politician, but the only advocate in the legislature that has a different view on pipelines, because both the governing party and the opposition party now are in lockstep to continue with John Horgan's vision for our resource industries.
Yeah. Yeah. A bit of a difficult situation out there. I imagine that you're at the forefront of the climate movement in BC. How would you say things are going with post-election of this government, and after everything that's happened at Fairy Creek and these protests? Is the climate movement more energized now than it was a few years ago? Do you think that there's some momentum that's building?
I do think that our trial really wasn't about us, and I was able to help galvanize some of the climate activists in the province, and that is carrying on, particularly with the emergence of Last Generation, which, as we know, is an illegal organization in places like Germany right now. But Last Generation, I believe, was under the banner of Last Generation, the recent Montreal Bridge occupation was the Last Generation, as well as another group, as I understand it. So the radical, disruptive organizations feel like we've got a new campaign beginning to address the LNG development that's occurring, particularly the new wood fiber LNG terminal that will be built in Howe Sound, just a short distance from Whistler and Vancouver. That's going to bring LNG tankers into, where we into the Salish Sea, in addition to Trans Mountain's oil tankers. So there's a huge impact on our whales. The only setback, Alex, is really the draconian approach of the BC Prosecution Service now to really crack down on disruptive actions. And so and any time that the NDP is in government, all of the activists within the party that are NDP members, we don't see them at climate actions.
Right.
They're just nowhere to be seen. And the same thing's reoccurring again. So
That's a very interesting point that you're making, because I find that when there's sort of center left wing politicians in power, like, Trudeau or David Eby or, Joe Biden, even, that it tends to really silence the left and silence activism. I feel like a lot of things that Trudeau has done, for example, like, buying that pipeline and, all of these anti-environment policies that he's done forward, all of these, pro-warfare positions and that kind of thing. If those positions were being taken by a conservative prime minister, the reaction from the left and the reaction in the streets would be far stronger. So, there's positive and negative sides of having the center left in power, because I think that, when it was Stephen Harper that was in power, like, activism was running a little bit stronger on the left than it is now. What do you think about that?
I agree with that observation for sure. And it, you know, I'm quite a bit older than you are, and I've seen it play out repeatedly.
Yeah.
So it's very unnerving, and it's probably one of the biggest reasons I moved to the Green Party, because I was shut down as a longtime eco-socialist within the NDP. Anything environmental got vetoed and rarely made it to the convention floor.
Yeah. Is there room for eco-socialists within the BC Green Party?
There's more, I would say, acceptance, and where I was quite active during the last election cycle, and I was embraced by everyone that I was working with. But at the same time, there's a little hesitation, I would say, because of my reputation, but
You got a good
nonetheless.
reputation. One of the hardest working activists I know.
So it was. I expected a little more pushback from some of the Greens in that respect, that I've known have sort of been wishy-washy when it comes to particularly civil disobedience,
Yeah.
and even more so if the more disruptive types of civil disobedience that sometimes doesn't have a lot of public appeal, like the highway blockades.
Yeah.
But I think everybody knows what's coming down the pipe now, right? We saw it provincially with pretty whacked out conservative candidates that mimic the mega conservatives south of the border. The same type of misogyny, the same kind of racism, denialism about residential schools, climate denial is just rampant
Yeah.
in that
And
caucus.
attitudes towards Palestine also.
Yeah. I marched lawfully with for in some 54 Palestinian weekly marches before I got sentenced, and now I can't go. I'm not permitted to join the movement directly any longer, so I'm doing things that I can do virtually to help them out, because we had the last student encampment was at the Vancouver Island University, and now those students that were active organizers have all been suspended for 2 to 3 years.
2 to 3
It's
years.
just so outrageous. It just makes my blood boil. And to see Israel right now has got just a circle of hate that they brought upon themselves by so many people, and yet we're not seeing it acknowledged that the popular sentiment is going towards the Palestinians, and we're not seeing that play out in any provincial or the federal government in any way. It's been quite the opposite. So I think we're headed to some very precarious moments in the future, not just here in British Columbia, but I started my progressive activism as an anti-war activist, and I don't understand where the people are. We used to have marches in the 80s in cities like Vancouver where 100,000 people marched, and now it's the media propaganda is just so effective in countering the truth
I
that,
know.
like I'm humiliated to be a Canadian today, right?
Yeah. No, some of the mainstream news you watch, and it's like every word, every sentence is put like to put the blame on Palestine and that kind of thing. I had a victory recently with Radio Canada, the French CBC. For years, they had been labeling every single article about Israel Palestine as Middle East, the eternal conflict. I filed a complaint with the ombudsperson. They came back saying that, oh, well, they're allowed to use the word eternal conflict because it's an expression, and therefore they don't have to respect the dictionary definition of the word. But despite the ombudsman defending them, about a month and a half later, they removed it from their site. This label was appearing on every single article. It was kind of like a category name that's inserted like as a subtitle to the articles.
Right.
So luckily, with Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, we were able to get them to remove that. But there's a lot of stuff like that. The way that things are framed in the mainstream media with Palestine and also with the conflict in Ukraine is very, very much pro warfare. And it's hard for people to cut through. I mean, they demonize every time somebody's speaking out, they're demonizing, they're anti-Semite, Russian agent, this kind of thing. Like, and for me, like in 2001, I was 13 years old, right? I was watching the news, but I wasn't living it the way I am as a political leader now. When I look back on those protests, those images of protests, in Montreal, for example, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people like marching against the war in Iraq. I'm like, how did they put this together? How did they manage to cut through all that propaganda and get that kind of support? Because like in the conflicts that we have today, it's very difficult to get crowds like that out. Like, sure, you can have people that protest for Palestine. A lot of people go out every single weekend to protest for it, but it's not like that big of a percentage of the population that's involved with that. And anytime like any politician says anything, it's like they try to throw them out. I was thrown out myself of the Green Party of Canada for speaking against the war in Ukraine. I was condemned by many of my colleagues, including, by the way, the leader of the BC Green Party. So I don't give her too much credit on that. Also, that I saw Sonia Firstno after October 7th had initially put out a statement calling for a ceasefire and stuff like that. And less than 2 hours later, she put out another tweet saying that, she'd received some calls from the Jewish community, and now she refers to Hamas as terrorists and all this, and withdraws what she says before. So I've also seen her posing in photos with the Canadian Jewish Public Affairs Committee. And for religious holidays too, like with the Hanukkah, like candles, therefore like giving a religious legitimacy to a group that is actually political and actually advocating for the state of Israel, for Canadian support of the state of Israel. So I think, it's not just in like one party. It's not just the Conservatives or just the Liberals. Like it goes down to each and every party. And, one of the things that makes it this way, since we're on the subject of the Canadian Jewish Public Affairs Committee, these people run like a school to teach pro-Israel youth how to get involved in Canadian politics, how to get jobs in members of parliament's offices. They call it a fellowship program. So it says right on their website, it's not hidden, it's not conspiracy, it's on their website. If you are pro-Israel, you can be admitted to this fellowship. We will introduce you to members of parliament from all parties. You'll be set up with a network, and the goal is that you get a low-level job in an MP's office and work your way up through politics. So, like, it's a training, it's a school to
Right,
influence Canadian
right.
politics. So it's a very big machine that we're up against, and it seems like
Mm-hmm.
the peace movement doesn't have those kind of institutions or funding. I'm working right now to organize a NATO counter summit because next weekend the NATO Parliamentary Assembly is going to be gathering in Montreal. So we're organizing a counter event, but it's a very small movement. It's not going to be thousands and thousands of people. I mean, there might be over 1,000 protesters. There's some demonstrations planned, but it's difficult to get things going, and it's difficult, especially to advocate for a perspective that is sort of blocked out of mainstream media. Like, they will not put you on TV to advocate against the war in Ukraine, or on Palestine, they've got a little bit more coverage, but they still always remind you that, it's the Palestinians, it's their fault. It all started on October 7th.
Right,
It's
right.
Hamas.
They don't refer to the journalistic guidebooks at all. It's a dictionary written by the Israeli Zionists now that defines almost every term that we once accepted as meaning one thing, and particularly in respect to human rights and militarism. It's all been flipped upside down to be used in such a way as to further criminalize Palestinian resistance. That's the really fearful part of it. It's not just, the left gets accused of cancel culture, but what's really coming down now is nothing short of fascism. And to see progressive politicians talking out of both sides of their mouths, like if there's a major Israeli Zionist scandal that that they can't refute, they will still have a Jekyll and Hyde moment where the very next day they're at the Israeli embassy giving a speech, or it's just there's no. It makes one think that everything they've ever said about human rights was just lip service.
Well, yeah,
Progressive, right? It's
yeah,
not an authentic. Because where are the red lines where we're now talking about nothing shy of the extermination of Palestine through, we started with an illegal occupation and an apartheid system modeled on what's occurred to our indigenous people here in Turtle Island, and now it's being there is no red line for genocide any longer. It's being accepted as a fait accompli. We're watching it be live streamed that annexation is now the agenda of the incoming Republican Party, and rest assured that Canada will be in lockstep at the UN in supporting it.
yeah. It's all about expanding the American empire, and I mean,
And
Israel is
greater
essentially,
Israel. Now, we got Huckabee, a Christian evangelical that doesn't recognize occupation, doesn't recognize the settlements, and certainly won't recognize genocide or ethnic cleansing. And we will see the elimination of the West Bank and Gaza as part of greater Israel very,
yeah,
very shortly. It's coming, and anybody that thinks otherwise is in denial or has serious blinders on.
yeah. I find it really hard to watch, so many Canadian politicians explain this away, using this, language to try and play the both sides aspect, when really there's no both sides to play there. There's one country, Israel, that is expanding its borders, right? Like since its creation, it's always been in expansion mode. And there's the other people who were there who are being colonized, or being violently thrown off their land, or being killed there, who are, having a treatment that corresponds to the definition of genocide. And
Yeah,
we're here,
yeah,
we're watching it, as you mentioned, live streamed, and also watching all the politicians find ways to justify it. One of the main ways that they justify is say, oh, Hamas is a terrorist organization. Okay,
everything began on October 7th, right?
exactly,
And
and
well, I'm sorry, I was deported from the Gishon prison 32 years ago. It's been a continuous. If the only thing that has really changed is the those with moral and ethical spines and are truly truth seekers have finally woken up to what's occurring now has a long historical breadcrumb going back to the British Empire and what they did with in 1948. It didn't, unlike every prefacing news story on CBC that begins with October 7th and Hamas, forgets the history of the region.
yeah. And also, in terms of Canadian history, like after the Second World War, there was loads of boats with Jewish people in the St. Lawrence here in Quebec, and we turned them around. They didn't want to settle the Jewish people like in all of these these different countries, including Canada. So we're responsible. The fact that, the Jewish people were, sort of sent to Israel on this colonial project, we have our share of responsibility in there as well. And, it makes me think also about the conflict in Ukraine, because when it broke out, like, Canada sort of challenged Russia and encouraged Ukraine to fight and all this sort of thing. Well, we accepted about, 300,000 Ukrainian refugees in Canada. 30,000 of those came to Quebec. Now, from what I understand, they were given healthcare cards, okay, and a work permit. They were not given permanent residency, okay? So now it's been a couple years and their health cards are expiring. Well, the Quebec government says they're not going to renew them. Well, where are these people supposed to go back to? There's a story on the news of a woman from Mariupol, right, which is now in Russian hands. The city was completely destroyed, captured by Russia. The people cannot go back, all right? And we're saying to them, oh, well, you might have to deliver your baby without healthcare coverage and pay 30 grand. There's another woman in her 70s that's in the long-term care facilities. If her healthcare card is not renewed, they're going to throw her out or charge $15,000 a month or something like that to keep her there. Like, it's incredible. The solidarity with Ukraine was about sending weapons. It wasn't actually about helping the refugees. They thought that, oh, we're going to win this war and all this. They romanticize it, the resistance and everything. But meanwhile, they got half the country destroyed, and now they don't want to give healthcare to the people that are displaced from it. They weren't willing to permanently resettle them. I find it's just completely outrageous how Canada and other countries can go and participate and provoke this war in Ukraine and then not even take care of the refugees that they create by their own stupidity in starting that war in the first place.
Right, right. No, it's shameful. And we have in our criminal code, I don't know how many times I've brought this up to RCMP, that we're singling us out in different Palestinian disruptive rallies that we have in the criminal code. And the RCMP is the first to say we do not selectively enforce the criminal code. Well, sure they are, because we have war crimes statutes in the criminal code, and crimes against humanity and so forth, and they are not addressing that. I had hoped to not be as constrained on house detention that I could have started a private prosecution to bring that point up in a court of law by challenging those responsible for the foreign policy abuses that you just outlined, that are hypocritical when we actually have laws that are there to be enforced.
That's it. It's supposed to be illegal to promote genocide within Canada, yet we see tons of people supporting Israel and using a genocidal language. No arrests taking place, no nothing. I mean, no threats of arrest. No, you don't hear people who are supporting Israel complaining about visits from the RCMP or stuff like that, or warnings or anything. Like, this discourse appears to be authorized. And I had an interesting conversation with Senator Yenpo Wu. He's a very progressive senator. I didn't know that there was decent people in the Senate before I met him. But basically, he said that, one of the reasons that Canada now imposed this weapons embargo to Israel, or, might not be complete, but they've announced something like that. He said that it took, the possibility of legal repercussions from genocide to get Canada to do that, So imagine that, now, the Canada is not even credible. Their weapons embargo is not even complete. Like,
but that it took the UN special rapporteur on
also, they wouldn't meet. The Canadian government wouldn't meet with her, right? And they vilified her.
What's really criminal is we have Palestinian Canadians that are not being brought back to Canada. One of the VIU students, she was the youngest in the family, and 12 of her family applied to come to Canada from Egypt when they got into Egypt, and she was the only one that was permitted, and probably because she's the youngest. But at the same time, it's like, just a minute here, are we not doing what we did with the example that you raised about those that were suffering the Nazi pogroms? were turned away from our shores. We're doing the same thing to not just Palestinians, but Palestinian Canadians aren't getting out. And the numbers are far less than the Ukrainians that we've accepted. And what's the trend? We're even going to prevent even more foreign students from coming to Canada at a time when our universities are all underfunded. Many of them will not survive the next decade if that were not to change, right? Because this local college that then became a university, for the most part, it was the foreign students that allowed it to grow. And now that's being reversed. Not only is it being reversed, they're suspending students that were already enrolled from graduation because they're taking participation in pro-Palestinian activities, right? It's
Yeah.
just I'm so disgusted with it all.
We're supposed to be we're supposed to be a
We
country
can
with rights and with freedom of speech and, the ability to participate in these conversations. And instead, there's all kinds of sanctions, all kinds of, academic sanctions and stuff like that. There's doctors who've been sanctioned, all kinds of stuff. You'd think that there'd be laws against that would be applied. You'd think there'd be laws against hate speech and against promotion of genocide that would actually be applied. It's incredible how twisted things can become and how Canada can deviate so much from the values that people expect to be like Canadian values. We can deviate from it so quickly
right.
with, sure, some protests and a lot of people who don't agree, but unfortunately, the influential people in the media and who kind of control things are not on our side.
Yeah, I did a workshop up at the university for a Palestinian event that very early on before the encampment was set up, and I was asked to make the connection to the climate issue, and it's just again another issue that we've got a well-established climate movement across the country, and yet it's not making the connections to militarism as it should be when we're witnessing two major wars that have enormous impact on the environment and our climate futures. And if anything, we're continuing that trend with talk of attacking Iran and things getting going potentially ballistic in terms of nuclear war. We've never been this close ever before, and yet what we've in terms of bombardment, particularly in Gaza, it's the equivalent of both two A bombs being dropped, and we're not making the connections whatsoever to what that impact is. I don't use the word revolution very often, but that's kind of where I'm devoting some of my thinking now is towards how do we get more people into the streets for all of these things before it's irreversible.
Yeah.
And the outcome is whether or not it's by war, nuclear war, or by climate mass destruction, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out just what it is that we are now on a trajectory toward. It's so, the atomic scientists are very clear that things have never been this dire. The climate scientists are saying pretty much the same thing. COP 29 is a joke. It's an embarrassment to think that we're going to get anything out of that because there's just, we've got a psychopath that is now going to drill baby drill is his mantra, and it may as well mean the same thing, bomb baby bomb as well, because he's if we think that it's going to end in Lebanon and Syria and Palestine, there's absolutely no way. There's absolutely no way. We've got UN peacemakers that are being slaughtered in Lebanon, right? the French are ticked off, the Italy's ticked off. Where, if for those that believe that NATO is the right course, this is destroying it just in another theater of war. Is showing Turkey is moving in the same direction. Saudi Arabia has taken a very different stand in terms of America. BRICS is becoming a credible alternative to the American dollar and its dominance. Things are the world order is being shaken up by the Zionist agenda in such a way that there's so much uncertainty with that strategy. Um, it's not a good time to be a human being on this planet.
Yeah. Well, what you're saying about, the emergence of a multipolar world, my hope would be that we can transition to this multipolar world without a massive confrontation. And I think for that, the United States and Western countries will have to accept the reality of the BRICS alliance. We'll have to accept the reality that China is a very strong country, as is Russia. They have a huge military, they have a huge manufacturing capacity, and they have a huge population, right? Like, honestly, like, United States and Canada is no match for China, We don't have that many people. And the people that we do have, we can barely get people to do jobs here. They're not going to want to sign up for the military, like we did in World War II, where 10% of the population was in the military and go over there and die in trench warfare. Like, like, people are really not there. Like millennials and stuff like that, they do not want to sign up for that. So to think that in some sort of a global conflict that, the United States and the Western empire would come out on top, I think is fictional. Like, these are big, important countries. And if we can transition to a planet where power is shared amongst different countries without having to go into all-out warfare to get there, I think that would be really positive for everybody. We're getting just a little bit past the 1 hour mark, so I think we should leave it there. Maybe we can follow up in a few weeks or months. And, it's always a pleasure talking with you, Howard. And I know that you've sacrificed so much for the environment and for peace. You've sacrificed your own liberty, right? You're coming to us here from house arrest as we speak. It's great that they didn't take away your freedom of expression. That way we can still have these conversations. But I want to thank you again for the very hard work that you're doing, the sacrifices that you're making. And
it's not a sacrifice. I've never viewed it as a sacrifice. I see it more as a moral and ethical parental duty. It always pings back to my children and grandchildren. There's this larger argument of, do we have a right to defend ourselves? Well, we do. There's a lot of talk about freedom right now, but the real freedom that we need to be fighting for is the freedom that starts in your own home, and politicians have to be held to account for the risks that they're posing to the current generation of youth. But in the worst moments of house arrest, in the lonely moments where I'm not seeing my family and so forth, it's the idea that there may not be any children on this planet. And when I look at a world map now, I just see children that are being slaughtered, whether or not it's the Sudan or, those facing the super typhoon in the Philippines. Children all over the world are far worse off than in terms of their chances of surviving what they've inherited from the current world order. And I don't know what the answer is, Alex, except that we all have to fight on. We have to persist.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to thank you again, Howard. I know you're a very humble man, but I think that what you're doing is a sacrifice of your freedom. And I think that if more people would be willing to make sacrifices like that, to stand up, that perhaps we could avoid many of the problems that we discussed in this episode. And so I wish you the best of luck in getting through this house arrest. I know it's definitely must be very difficult at times, and I hope that you have a good community of people that are there supporting you. And I look forward to our next discussion.
Thank you, Alex.